Here we go.
It ain't no line without that nine. 9 times, 25th anniversary, baby. I got the game with me. I'm the freshman. I have a bunch of seniors. We all we got.
I'm your second chief Yellow Pocahontas, and that's some pretty big shoes to fill. And normally, Mardi Gras Day, we pretty much finish the suits. But, you know, with us, you know, at our standards with these big crowns and everything, you know, what you see Mardi Gras Day is an edited version of what we had in our mind to build as a suit.
Right now, they could just put something on me, L'Oreal out of here, and go up.
How the fuck Skip wasn't on here? That's what the fuck I was saying.
And a pair of animals, yeah, I'm an animal. Be on that Cali dro, I'm a 3rd G nigga, daddy from the Cali, yo. I was 12 years old when I hit the balance stove. I'm a N.O. nigga, the murder capital. I'm a K cutter, sparkle out the window, let it blow. Old nigga Derek gave me coke way back in 94. Them niggas hated on them 96, God bless his soul. Man, I'm so...
DSU News Channel 6, on your side.
Wow. Fight going on right
Council chaos. Tonight, fights flared up inside the council chambers as protesters tried to stop demolition of the city's public housing development.
Here is what is happening right now.
In the past 100 minutes, the council voted unanimously in favor of demolition, but construction companies will not get the permits needed to begin until Mayor Ray Nagin signs off. The council is back in session right now to deal with other matters.
And we have team coverage tonight. WDSU News Channel 6 reporter Heath Allen will tell us what happened when the protest turned personal. And reporter Richie Angelico has the mayor's reaction. But first, reporter Travers Mackel and the dramatic way the day unfolded at City Hall. He is on your side live with tonight's big local story. Good evening, Travers.
Good evening to you, Camille. Let me break everything down. About 200 people can fit inside the council chambers. Once they got to max capacity, they closed these gates. You can still see the chain link wrapped around the fence. Protesters had to stay outside, and that's where everything just started to boil over.
Public housing in New Orleans has been subject to federal control for a number of years. Before Hurricane Katrina, the housing projects in New Orleans have also been home to important cultural contributions, such as the birth of bounce music. Some of the first developments will break ground between 1938 and 1940 over slums and old stores in the Treme and Uptown areas. The Lafitte, Magnolia, Callio, and St. Thomas all opened in 1941 to black families. After Hurricane Katrina, many of Hano's residents were forced to evacuate their apartments due to water damage, although many buildings sustained only minor damage. At the time of the storm, the Housing Authority of New Orleans was serving 14,129 families. Out of those, 64%, or 8,981, received vouchers, while 36%, or 5,148, were in public housing. After families moved out, most of the projects were demolished and converted into mixed-income townhomes. Between 2005 and 2013, Hano would demolish all of its properties, with only a couple of buildings preserved as historic landmarks. This is the story of the most violent projects in New Orleans. The St. Thomas Project was one of the oldest housing projects of New Orleans. Initially, the original site was located in the Irish Channel. which is bordered by Chapachoulas, St. Charles, Felicity, and Phillip Streets. Living conditions and crime would become a problem during the mid-1970s when that Doochie would flood the project. Violent crimes and drug dealing would continue in the Thomas throughout the 80s and 90s. It is no secret that the St. Thomas Project was one of the most notorious housing projects in the city of New Orleans. The project, which lay south of Central City in the Lower Garden District, was one of the biggest in the city. As defined by the City Planning Commission, its boundaries were Constant, St. Mary, Magazine Street, and Felicity Streets to the north, the Mississippi River to the south, and First, St. Thomas, and Chippewa Streets with Jackson Avenue to the west. In the 1980s and the 1990s, the Thomas will be recorded as one of the city's most dangerous and impoverished housing projects. The Thomas will make national headlines in 1992 after the deadly shooting of Eric Boyd. In 1982, Helen would move into the Thomas in order to live and work with the people of the community. While there, Helen would eventually begin corresponding with Patrick Sonnier, who had been sentenced to death for the murder of 2 teenagers. After witnessing the executions, Helen would pen the novel Dead Man Walking. The book will go on to inspire the self-titled 1999 film Dead Man Walking. In 1991, the Thomas will lead all housing projects and rates of violent crime, according to the Housing Authority. From 1987 and 1991, the residents of the Thomas will report 48 murders, 370 robberies, and 638 assaults. In 1996, the Housing Authority of New Orleans would apply for and receive a HUD HOPE grant to demolish and rebuild the Thomas. The approved grant would include the cost of relocating nearly 3,000 then residents to other properties. By the end of 2001, all of the buildings except a few had been demolished to create a mixed-income neighborhood, aka River Garden. Officially called the B.W. Cooper, the Callio Projects, located in Central City, New Orleans, was one of the deadliest projects in the city. There were 1,546 units on 56 acres of land, equaling 24 city blocks. The Yo was built between 1939 and 1941. The original boundaries were South Durgeon, Erato, Callio, now Earhart Boulevard, and South Prayer Streets. In 1941, rent ran from $8.25 a month for a 1-bedroom apartment to $22 a month for a 3-bedroom apartment. During the Callio's early days, it was considered to be a means for working-class families to live comfortably while saving up the funds to purchase their own homes. There were 690 apartments in the original development. In 1949, a gymnasium was added at Broad and Callio Streets. In 1954, a 12-block expansion would add 860 new units. This expansion would push the western boundary of the Callio back 2 blocks from Erato Street to Melpomene Avenue, which is now Martin Luther King Boulevard. Ever since the early 80s, rival drug dealing cliques have operated in and around the Callio, spawning what law enforcement in New Orleans will call a seemingly non-stop cycle of retaliatory violence. According to the New Orleans Police Department, the violence escalated in the late 80s, peaking in the early 90s. After Scully was gunned down in the project in 1987, the drug trade spiraled out of control in a war over the drug trade in the Yo. From 1993 to 2004, 88 people will be killed in the Callio projects. The infamous Cut Boys will reign supreme from the late 90s into the early 2000s. The apples wouldn't fall too far from the tree, as younger generations of killers will go on to dominate the Yo throughout the mid to now current 2000s. In the wake of Hurricane Katrina, most of the Callio will be closed and slated for demolition. In January of 2007, a small section of the Callio would be reopened to residents. The Yo will be completely demolished in 2014. The new B.W. Cooper, aka Callio, will reopen in 2012 under its new name, Marrero Commons. The 175-unit development was named after Yvonne Marrero, a community leader and former president of the B.W. Cooper Resident Management Corporation. The Florida housing development was built in 1946 on an 18.5-acre tract of land bounded by Florida Avenue and North Durgeon, Mazant, and Gallia Streets in the upper 9th Ward. It would resemble most public housing complexes with 47 2- and 3-story brick buildings for a total of 734 units housing 1,297 residents that were arranged around the courtyards that were largely isolated from the rest of the community. Originally built for whites, Florida would be desegregated by the 1970s, becoming a majority black project. In the mid-90s, the Florida and nearby Desire Project were dubbed as the most violent housing projects in the nation. In 1994, the Florida will record the highest homicide rate out of all handled developments with 26 slain, surpassing the 13 killings in the Desire, which previously held the highest record a year before. Majority of the Florida killings in 1994 were fueled by drug wars, specifically between the notorious Hardy Boys and the Pooney Crew. The homicide spike in the Florida and Desire will be the main factor contributing to the city becoming the murder capital of America. That year, the city's homicide rate would reach 424, with 47 of those killings happening in the projects. In 2005, the project was heavily flooded during Hurricane Katrina and partially demolished by the end of that year. One half of the complex will be later remodeled. Concordia was selected to design a master plan to build phase 1 of the revitalization of the Florida. The master plan will focus on designing a concept for the decentralization of the site and the addition of new mixed income housing. The architectural design for the Florida was broken into 5 separate contracts, which were designed and constructed concurrently. The Melfomine project was constructed in 1964. The site was once made up of single and multi-family houses. By the late 1950s, the city was declared in the slums, which paved the way for the project. The Melf was the youngest surviving housing project in New Orleans. The high-rise will undergo major renovations in 2002. In the 80s and 90s, the project was a well-known drug area as it was once overran by dope dealers, many of whom were as young as 12 were pumping on the ramps and hallways of the project. In 2004, 3 of 6 low-rise buildings were demolished after failing to meet the Housing Authority of New Orleans economic visibility guidelines. In 2006, it was one of few housing projects in the city that would survive Hurricane Katrina with minimal damage. In 2012, officials would approve a $30 million bond for the final phase of redevelopment. The last building will finally be demolished in 2013. Construction of phase 3 will begin in 2013 at a cost of $61 million through the use of $26 million from HANO, $21.9 million from FEMA, $13.1 million in low-income housing tax credits. The new Gus Homes would open for tenants in 2018 with 638 homes located on the entire Gus site, 577 of which are public housing units.
When y'all talk about the city of New Orleans, uptown, especially uptown, you can't miss me. If you do, you're hating. When you talk about the city of New Orleans, uptown area, you can't miss me. If you do, you hating.
Before I drop an album, before I did anything, you know what I'm saying? I was a hood celebrity, you dig? I'm a gangster in the hood just having a good time. So when I show love to all my people, I'm gonna get that same love back.
Well, being from the Magnolia Project, people from all over the world, when they come to New Orleans, they want to see what that is.
I'm Skip Boo from all the Magnolia. Grew up in the Tyler Dynacourt.
I'm Kenneth Boo, you hear me? I was raised uptown in the Magnolia.
I'm original Dooney boy, Johnny Boo, man, from the Magnolia Project.
$2400 Washington Avenue, New Orleans, Louisiana. 70115 is the actual physical address for the Magnolia CJP Public Housing Project. Some would argue that the actual physical address is 3301 Ferret Street. If you know, you know. The Magnolia that was designated by the city for black residents only consisted of low-rise brick buildings arrayed around grassy courtyards, eventually growing to include 1,400 apartments. The Housing Authority of New Orleans would bulldoze several square blocks to build the Magnolia. Frank Pania, a local business owner, would have to move his barbershop from its footprint. Frank would then open the Dewdrop Inn across the street, selling food and drinks to the workers building the complex. Frank would later expand, adding live music in 1945. The new Dewdrop Inn would go on to be one of the most historical monuments in the NO. This is the story of the Wild Magnolia. Before Hurricane Katrina would make landfall in New Orleans in 2005, the privatization of public housing was already underway. Since 1996, Hope grants through the Department of Housing and Urban Development were used by developers and organizations to demolish and replace public housing projects with mixed income housing in order to redevelop entire neighborhoods. The Housing Authority of New Orleans has been in federal receivership since 2002, granting HUD direct control over New Orleans public housing. After Katrina, the rate of demolition for viable and structurally sound public housing in New Orleans would increase under the guise of disaster recovery. CJP, aka the Magnolia, was one of the big four public housing developments that were slated for complete demolition after Katrina. Since 1998, CJP had been in the process of being emptied and partially demolished, with only 144 people living there at the time of the storm. In spite of community resistance, the Noya would be fully demolished and redeveloped as Harmony Oaks, beginning in late 2008. At its height, the Noya would operate 1,403 public housing units. Today, only 143 units on the site are designated as public housing. Phase 1 of the Magnolia project was constructed in 1941, bordered by Louisiana Avenue, Magnolia Street, Washington Avenue, and LaSalle Street. In 1955, the Noya was expanded north past Clara Street, incorporating 6 additional city blocks, creating the Old Side, New Side. Taladana would be realigned during the 1955 expansion, resulting in the disappearance of the 3-block-long residential street, Belmont Place. The only remnants of Belmont Place will be 3 houses facing Taladana before it joins with Louisiana Avenue. During the Jim Crow era of racial segregation, the city's main medical care facility for blacks would be Flint Goodrich Hospital, located on the southwest end of Ferret Street on Louisiana Avenue. Fun fact, the first 3 black mayors of New Orleans were all born at Flint Goodrich Hospital. From 1952 through 1978, the housing manager for the Noya was Cleveland Joseph Pete. In the 1980s and 90s, living conditions in the Noya had been neglected. They would severely decline when that hard would hit the scene. Crime activity would increase, as well as the patrol of the corrupt NOPD. In addition to being home of famous hip-hop artists, Soulja Slim, Juvenile, and others, Magnolia would have one of the highest deletion rates of any housing projects in the United States. In New Orleans, as in other big cities in America, crime and violence typically will go unseen by visitors. Most of the deletions are highly concentrated in specific neighborhoods, corners, or housing projects. The Magnolia will be one of those locations. In 2003, New Orleans would again have the highest deletion rate in the United States, with 275 in total, for a per capita rate 8 times worse than New York City's. According to the Times-Picayune, nearly all 275 of those crushings in 2003, along with the people accused of crushing them, would all have criminal records. Among the victims, more than a third were smashed within 3 months of their last arrest. In other words, America's policies were fueling violence and deletions in some of its biggest cities. In 2001 and 2002, demolition of portions of the Noya will begin as part of the Housing Authority of New Orleans revitalization plan. By 2005, only the 1955 expansion had been raised. The majority of the remaining buildings were vacant and fenced off, with only a portion still occupied when the area flooded in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. Redevelopment will be delayed in the aftermath of the disastrous flood, which devastated the majority of the city. In late 2008, the Magnolia projects were vacated. The majority of the buildings were razed. On January 7th of 2009, local, state, federal, and HUD officials met to break ground on a new $183 million CJP community meant to replace the Magnolia projects. The plan would include 460 units, a recovery school district, and YMCA in the first phase. 2/3 of the community would be mixed use and mixed income, with the rest being market value apartments and townhomes. In 2011, the rebranded Harmony Oaks community, developed by McCormick Warren Salazar, opened as a mixed-use community of 406 apartments and homes, including public housing, low-income, and market-rate dwellings. The new Harmony Oaks, redeveloped on the old Magnolia project site, is located on some 41 acres southeast of the intersection of Claiborne and Louisiana. The site is bounded by Washington Avenue to the east, LaSalle Street and Ferret to the south, Louisiana and Taladana Avenues to the west, and South Claiborne Avenue to the north. The redeveloped projects are considered to be a continuation of New Orleans as the NO moves forward towards new urbanism, favoring urban neighborhood development over suburban living. Per records from the Federal Bureau of Investigations, at one point, Denoya would be one of the most notoriously dangerous housing projects in the entire United States. It was reported that the Magnolia projects had the highest deletion rate of any housing project in the city, even more than the Melf and the Callio. Denoya would have a local crime rate higher than many full municipalities in the United States, spawning a significant influence in New Orleans with its extremely high deletion rate. Taking a look back in time, in 1951, there would be 66 crushings, with 53% of them committed with Blix. This would be from citing stats from the Orleans Parish Coroner's Office. In 1973, out of the 252 deletions, 71% would be committed with Blix. Infamously known for street crews, the Four Horsemen will be one of the first to stomp the grounds of the Magnolia projects. You can't mention Denoya without mentioning OGs like Jeff Sanders, Roy Lee, Bo Hickey, Blabber, KC, Lester Duplessis, Mackie Moe, and Eric Maurice, just to name a few. The mid-90s will birth an entirely new generation of street figures in Denoya. The Hot Boys, a notorious street crew known for crushing, taking hits, and jacking, will be in full effect in the mid to early 90s. As the Hot Boys will seemingly die off and be incarcerated by the late 90s, the Dooney Boys will be in power throughout Denoya. This run wouldn't last long, as going forward into the 20th century, other notorious street crews will roam the streets of Denoya. Although Denoya would be involved in several street wars, one of the most infamous wars would be Denoya versus the Yo. Fought in the mean streets of the NO, this war would spawn casualties on both sides. The Treme 6th Ward neighborhood is located between Rampart Street, Esplanade Avenue, Broad Street, and St. Louis Street on the uptown side of the Lafitte corridor. The neighborhood is between Tulane and Guerriere to the west and the 7th Ward to the east. Since Treme was divided culturally and physically divided after the insertion of I-10 onto Claiborne Avenue, the Treme Community Improvement Association would be organized in 1969 to combat a seemingly uncaring civic attitude about the neighborhood. The Tambourine and Fan Social Club was formed in 1980 to revive Treme's history as being one of the focal points for Mardi Gras. The Greater Treme Consortium would be founded in 1993 to increase the neighborhood's economic revival, primarily through promotion of home ownership and the renovation of abandoned and blighted housing. Many New Orleanians still reflect on the days when housing projects were safe havens to visit or places to live in while growing up in the city. Life will be quite different from what you have seen and heard about on the news, in the streets, and on social media in current times. One of these projects will be the Lafitte, located in the historic 6th Ward, built in 1941. The Lafitte was said to have been, at that time, the largest and finest low-rent housing project in the South, as well as the second largest in the nation for black. By August 19th of 1941, the Lafitte would be completely filled with tenants, occupying 16 city blocks bounded by Lafitte, Orleans, North Claiborne, and Jersey streets. The Lafitte would have 896 units housing approximately 3,000 tenants. Before construction would begin, workers would level the entire area between North Westerblave, Claiborne, Orleans, and Lafitte in order to make room for the new projects. The demolition of the homes that once preoccupied the space would be welcomed due to the deplorable living conditions that tenants were forced to live under for years. In selecting applications for living in Lafitte, Hanover would specifically choose those that had formerly lived on the site, provided their yearly income was low enough. Costing over $4 million, the project would be completed in little over 12 months. R.P. Farnsworth and Company would be selected as the general contractor for the actual work being carried out by local craftsmen who have been given credit for the Lafitte structures being considered as some of the best in the nation. The Lafitte would be the 5th of 6 housing projects to be built in New Orleans. The first would be the Magnolia, followed by the St. Thomas, the Callio, the Iberville, and then the Lafitte. The final build will be the St. Bernard, which will be completed in January of 1942. The St. Thomas and Iberville had been constructed for white tenants only, while the other 4, the Noya, the Yo, the Lafitte, and the Bernard, would be for African Americans. Upon opening in 1941, rent in the Lafitte would vary according to income. An income of $450 a year would pay $8.25 a month. The highest rent would be $22 for a family earning $1,474 annually with 3 children. The Lafitte, as expected, will stimulate business in the area. Thousands of dollars will be spent by residents in and around the projects. Galado's food store, located at 2039 Orleans Street, will be the place to make groceries. On the corner of North Galvez and Orleans, Carbos, a big discount service station which sold tires, batteries, radios, gasoline, kerosene, and furnace oil. In the 1960s, the middle class will flee to the suburbs, transforming entire areas of the inner city into ghettos. In the 80s, the project will begin to rapidly decline as that horde will flood the Treme area. Living conditions would also become a problem, as well as crime. Hustling and crushing will become common in the Lafitte. The Lafitte will become one of many New Orleans housing projects being ran by hustlers and steppers. People still talk about David Williams, aka Wild Bill, who set a man on fire in the Lafitte project in 1994. Wild Bill was a known jacker who did pretty much what he wanted in the Lafitte, which was patrolled by the corrupt NOPD. The NO would have the highest deletion rate in the country at the time. While Bill would be accused of armed robbery, the victim would be afraid to testify. While Bill was also accused of bashing a Vic with a wooden post because the Vic owed him $12. The victim and witnesses to this act would be afraid to testify as well. In August of 1994, Wild Bill would handcuff Thomas May, douse him with gas, and set him on fire in the courtyard of the Lafitte. It was rumored that the courtyard was full of people standing around that were too afraid to intervene. Ultimately, no one would attempt to put out the fire that had been burning the man for several minutes. It wouldn't be long before Wild Bill's name would be ringing for the act that he pulled off. Michael Perlstein, a reporter with the Times-Picayune, would name Wild Bill as the prime suspect in an article based on interviews with people who lived in the Lafitte. Out of all of the people interviewed, none would testify. During trial 2 years later, Wild Bill will be convicted on the testimony of the only witness to come forward, a 12-year-old girl. By 2002, conditions would worsen. The richly manicured gardens were gone. Many of the lawns were paved over and replaced by basketball courts, while huge garbage bins will be scattered across the decaying lots. In 2006, after Hurricane Katrina, the Lafitte would be rat-infested, boarded up, and closed. It wouldn't be until 2012 that a group known as Urban Design Associates be given a charter award to develop a new housing project on the old Lafitte site. The UDA would name the apartments the new Lafitte. The new apartments would ultimately become a redevelopment of the 27-acre housing project that had been closed for the past 7 years. The new 812 units will provide affordable mixed-income housing with both rentals and for-sale properties. The new property will give an opportunity for former Lafitte residents to return to their neighborhood.
You are now about to witness the strength of street knowledge. For the New Jack City.
On Wednesday, December 17th of 2014, a state grand jury would indict 6 alleged members of the 6th Ward Wildside, accusing them of a racketeering conspiracy that wraps together a half-dozen crushings from 2011 and 2012, along with other crimes allegedly committed to bolster a thriving boy and girl business. The 15-count indictment would describe the crew, also known as the Wildside Gangsters, or WSG, as steppers that mercilessly deleted their ops. The indictment would also read that the members of the group hooked up with accused members of other notorious New Orleans street crews. One of the indicted men, 23-year-old Damian Smallface Abram, allegedly traded a 40 he used in the deletion of Derek Howard and Darrell Long on January 26 of 2012 with McCoy Rat Walker, an alleged member of 3NG, named in a similar indictment that was handed up in 2013. The new indictment will mark the latest bid by Orleans Parish District Attorney Leon Canizaro's office to corral suspected street crews in a broad conspiracy covering a range of crimes over time. They will use a once obscure state law that mirrors a federal statute created to go after the mafia. Defense advocates would argue that the indictments often go too far, trying to draw outlining associates into lengthy prosecutions with subpar evidence that they were involved in street activity at the core of the indictments. The latest document would allege numerous crimes as well as home invasions and crushings on the part of 6 WSG members. Along with Abram and Mitchell, it names Rashad Shot Blackwell, 26, Blake Blizzy Ricks, 25, Randall Marshall, 23, and Joseph Marshall, 28. All 6 will be named in the first 2 counts, which allege a far-reaching racketeering conspiracy that includes 28 overt acts and a conspiracy to distribute 11.5. The Desire Housing Project, a Hanover managed property located in the Upper Ninth Ward, will be deemed as one of the most crucial projects in the city. The build of the Desire was authorized by the Housing Act of 1949. Construction of the Desire project will begin in 1949 and be completed by 1956. Cut off from the rest of the city, the Industrial Canal, Florida Canal, and railroad tracks on all four sides, the D contained 262 two-story buildings featuring 1,860 apartments, making it, at the time, one of the largest housing projects in the country. By the 1960s, the Desire project housed more than 13,000 residents on a plot of land slightly less than 100 acres in actual size, making it the area with the greatest population density in New Orleans. Two elementary schools, Houghton and Lockett, were included in the construction of the Desire housing projects. Many of those moved into the housing projects have been displaced by urban renewal projects elsewhere in the city. Situated on swampland that had formerly been the site of a landfill, the Desire project buildings were poorly constructed using wood and brick veneer to cut costs and will fall into despair within a few years of occupancy. Funding derived from Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty programs helped bring in a new community center, pool, daycare center, and health clinic. September of 1965, Hurricane Betsy swept through New Orleans. The bottom floor apartments within the Desire housing projects were inundated with floodwater. Wind and water damage destroyed trees and shrubs throughout the project. Little was done by Hano to repair the damage caused by the hurricane. In 1970, the New Orleans Committee to Combat Fascism, the NCCF, a Black Panther shoot-off, not the actual group as most of you uneducated commenters on history would like to believe, moved to the Desire project and began organizing within the community, implementing their free breakfast program as well as other initiatives. Unbeknownst to many, Brother Malik Rahim was one of the early leaders who formed the actual New Orleans Black Panther chapter. The NOPD would engage in two shootouts with the NCCF in an effort to purge the group from the neighborhood. Members of the group would later be arrested. In 1971, Hano planned to modernize the D, but the plans were eventually deemed too costly. In 1975, Hano would use funds from the Department of Housing and Urban Development to perform deferred maintenance and other improvements. Over the 1970s and 1980s, the Desire would undergo a steady outward migration of residents. Ongoing deterioration of the buildings as well as a steady increase in crime will contribute to the outflow. Historically, the Desire was known as the city's most dangerous project and would be documented as being one of the deadliest communities in the country. Starting in the late 1960s, most of the crime would be from residents having few economic opportunities and thus fighting for income made available by the 11-5 trade. When that horde arrived in the mid-80s, crime rate in the D would increase even further as crime would infest the project. Residents will begin moving out to flee the physical and social decay. Abandoned apartments will provide convenient places to stash. Deals and crushings will become commonplace in the D. The alleys and courtyards in the D will become a place where former residents will claim that life was often considered worth less than a pair of new tennis. The upstick and deletions will give the D a reputation for violence along with the nearby Florida, aka Florida projects. If you know, you know. This all being during a time that deletions were so bad in the NO that the NOPD would celebrate 350 crushings compared to 413 crushings a year before, which was a mere 15%. Not even enough to put a dent in the crushings. The crime rate in the D would be 300% above the entire nation. The 9.5 acres of land encompassed by the D has many stories. One of those stories would be that of Len Davis, the Hardy Boys, and Kim Groves. A lot of notorious street figures would hail from the D. Alter, Poolman, Sterling, Lloyd, Slugger, Curry, Freddie Smooth, Sean Howard, and Red Trammell, just to name a few. In February of '95, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development would approve a HOPE grant for Hano to improve the living environment through rehabilitation of the project. As demolition would begin in 1997, the project would be completely razed by 1999. The D would seem to have taken on a new outlook. Before crime could slow down and residents could fully settle in, Hurricane Katrina would destroy the 318 rental units that were being constructed, as well as 107 rental units that had just been finished and occupied.
But now we're about to witness the strength of street knowledge.
One thing for sure, two things for certain. The city of New Orleans was home to some of the most notorious housing developments in America. These housing developments are called projects. One of the most notorious street figures to be birthed out of the Ninth Ward was Walter Pooh Man Sterling. The Sterling family were no strangers to the N.O., birthing known steppers such as Terrell Turbo Sterling. Born May 29th, 1972, to Miss Brenda Sterling, Walter Pooh Man Sterling was the father of 12 children, one of which is Lamar Peters, a highly acclaimed basketball prospect at the time from the University of Mississippi State.
Holman thought about the three, left open, possibly got away with a walk. Peters is open.
Pooh Man would be in and out of the criminal justice system ever since his adolescent years. Walter was a stepper, but was also known for being a pretty boy that stayed sharp. If you know, you know. It was once alleged that in the 80s, Pooh Man would pull off a Gennaro meatball author by dressing up as a woman and deleting his ops. With his Sterling family connections, Pooh Man would move around the city with ease. It is rumored that his people, Terrell Turbo Sterling, niece's apartment was in the same hallway with Killer Stone's mom, Miss Essie. According to Terrence Gangster Williams, Killer Stone would not like this at all and would be waiting in the cut with the yapper.
96, 97 something. It's a town people, the Cali Project, Pooh Man, and another old head named Walter Sterling. Pooh Man, Walter Sterling, and another old head named Terrell. But they was old heads, and Terrell had a niece that lived right next to right next to Killer Stone. And one day I pulled up in the driveway, and Killer Stone out in the driveway with a chopper. I'm like, "What's up?" He's like, "Man, they gotta go." I said, "What you mean?" He said, "I said, what they did? They tried to rob you." He said, "No, I don't like the fact that these two known killers next door to my house, in the project next door. This don't sit right with me." So I was like, "Man, the old town, his niece live right here. His niece, they ain't doing nothing. I don't think we should make this move." So, because I would have had to back him, So we talked, cancel the plan.
Pooh Man was a certified stepper in the streets. No stranger to packing an iron, Pooh Man would always be strapped. In 2016, Pooh Man would plead guilty to being a convicted felon in possession of a firearm. Pooh Man would appeal this conviction, arguing that the courts issued him a steeper sentence based on his criminal background and not the sentencing guidelines. Pooh Man would also argue that the courts didn't take into consideration other mitigating factors. Those factors were: 1, he had established family relationships and was affected by his brother's death. 2, that the best way to prevent being a repeat felon was to treat his drug and not to confine him to the penitentiary. Pooh Man's appeal would be denied and he would be sentenced to 120 months. Upon Pooh Man's release from prison, he would marry Sparkle, the love of his life. This would be huge for Pooh Man, as he was dedicating himself to being a family man and attempting to leave his past behind him. Since his release, Pooh Man had become heavily involved in youth sports and family activities with his kids. The night of January 11th, 2017, Lamar Peters, the son of Walter Pooh Man Sterling, will receive the most horrifying phone call in his life. Early that night, before receiving the call that his father, Walter Pooh Man Sterling, had been shot, Lamar had just talked to his dad about him attending the Mississippi State versus Kentucky game. That, unfortunately, would be the last time that he would speak to his father. Pooh Man would go to a bar with some of his partners. As the night progressed, the DJ would call the license plate number of Pooh Man's car, saying that it needed to be moved. Pooh Man, not knowing what fate was ahead of him, would walk outside to move his car. Immediately after shots would ring out, Pooh Man would be found lying unresponsive with multiple shot wounds at around 10:40 near the intersection of St. Bernard Avenue and Murray Street. One bystander in the crowd was saying that she heard the shots. She would say the first shot was like a cannon, something that she's never heard before. Then multiple shots would ring out as if there was a shooting brigade. The bystander, who too was afraid for her life, would leap to the ground and tell the occupants of her home to do the same. This unfortunate turn of events would be disheartening to the Sturden family. Pooh Man's son was merely a freshman at Mississippi State at the time. But will go on to sign with the New York Knicks. Located in the city's 7th Ward, the St. Bernard Project was built over a few decades, beginning in the 1940s. It would have the distinction of being the second largest housing project in the city. The St. Bernard Project, located in downtown New Orleans, a sub-district of Mid-City, will consist of boundaries defined by the New Orleans City of Planning and Commission, Harrison Avenue to the north, Paris Avenue to the east, Lafayette Street and Florida Avenue to the south, with Bayou St. John to the west. Like most public housing projects in the NO, the Bernard would be deemed not a very safe project, as it would become a battleground for hustlers during the height of the late 80s. The Bernard was once nicknamed Dodge City due to the wild busing back and forth that would occur between rival crews. Throughout the early 2000s, there were 44 crushings and 680 serious acts committed in the St. Bernard. Between 2002 and 2003, the Bernard would have a total of 25 deletions, 13 smashings in 2002, and 12 crushings in 2003. Many of the residents blamed Hano for displacing residents from other housing projects for the rise in deletions. At one point, the St. Bernard Project would go by the nickname the St. Bernard Thomas, a spinoff from the St. Thomas and St. Bernard projects. According to the NOPD, the St. Bernard projects will record around a dozen deletions per year. The NOPD would attribute the crushings to turf wars. However, the deletions would eventually decline, giving residents hope that peace may soon be a reality for their housing development. Some would speculate that the crime situation in the Bernard was beginning to improve due to the crime themselves. According to the NOPD, rival ops were knocking each other off, solving half of the problem. The other half was being dealt with legally by locking them up. When Hurricane Katrina ravaged New Orleans' largest public housing developments in 2005, civic leaders would reinvent the St. Bernard's housing community as the Columbia Park. The Columbia Park revitalization would be one of the largest urban transformation projects to ever take place in the USA. The Bernard, once plagued by crime, failing schools, and overcrowding, would successfully replicate a mixed-income housing model pioneered by a community in Atlanta, Georgia. The St. Bernard Housing Community, SBHC, constructed in the 1940s, is New Orleans' longest-running public housing community. At its peak, the Bernard would have 13,333 units. By 2005, the building's infrastructure had deteriorated to the point that only 960 units were livable. A racially profiled article posted in the Time-Picayune would read that the residents of the St. Bernard were living in tremendous poverty with very low educational achievement. Only 2 schools in the community were ranked in the lowest percentile of the public school system of New Orleans. There was really no opportunity for children to escape the area through education. It all would become a massive problem in terms of criminal activity. 4 years prior to Hurricane Katrina, there were 44 deletions and 680 felonies on the 53 acres of the former St. Bernard footprint. The NOPD will report that it was a very, very dangerous community to live in. In 2017, a man accused of 4 crushings in New Orleans would quietly plead guilty to reduced charges the day after a grand jury would expand the scope of a sweeping street crew case involving him and 5 others. Elroy Illy Krish would plead guilty to connection with 4 deletions in early 2017 after prosecutors reduced the charges against him from second degree to manslaughter. Illy would also accept responsibility for a slew of other charges. Criminal District Judge Karen Herman would sentence Illy to 35 years in prison the same day. However, court records did not show whether Illy had agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. Guilty pleas would come the day after the grand jury would charge 2 more men as suspects in the crushings of Kayla Bieniemy, a mother of 5, at the door of her New Orleans East apartment. The new indictment would read that Illy, Vernell Vernk Nelson, and Andre Dre Francis were involved in deleting Bieniemy. The incident would leave a courtyard in the Chateau d'Orleans complex littered with dozens of shell casings. Vernon and Dre will be charged with second degree. It is alleged that all three men were trying to smash another man when they deleted Bieniemy, according to the 17-count indictment that will come out nearly 2 months after Illy was charged with the crushing. Bieniemy's relatives will say the target was her ex-boyfriend, Vernon, who was already in custody in connection with a separate armed robbery when the grand jury handed down the new indictment, would be charged. Dre will be booked later on the same charges. The deletion of Bieniemy will come at the end of a spurt of violence that would involve 6 men working together to carjack and smash their ops. The first crushing would take place on January 27th when Illy and Edmund Toon Bacchus were accused of busting 3 women inside a car in the 7th Ward. The woman's vehicle was found at North Claiborne and Orleans Avenue. Latanya Clark would lose her life. The other 2 women would survive. Illy would also be accused of smashing brothers Tory and August Riley on St. Roch Street on January the 28th. It was alleged that Illy would then team up with Vernon and Dre to delete Bieniemy on the morning of February the 2nd. The NOPD will report that the crushing spree ended that night after police and federal agents swooped in on a house in the 2300 block of Murray Street to arrest Illy, Cole, and Toon. Inside the crib, investigators will recover 2 choppers, a glizzy, and 2 Rugers. Cole will be charged with 9 counts in connection with the group's activity. Cole will plead guilty the same day as Illy, receiving a 9-year prison term. Defense attorney Jeffrey Smith will state that Cole and Illy were close friends growing up. Cole, who was raising a family in Arizona before making the mistake of returning to the NO, had played on himself. Bernie Porsche, Creole pronunciation, Bernie Porsche, aka Tank, whom would have ties in both the Magnolia and St. Bernard projects, would pass at the age of 37 after an incident with state police. Officers would allegedly be on patrol looking for stolen vehicles when trying to make a traffic stop on a vehicle they believed to be stolen. As they were stopping the vehicle, one subject would hop out and start busting at them, hitting one of them in the left elbow. During the hunt for suspects, they would come across one of the suspects who would later be identified as Bernie Porsche, aka Tank, near Law and New Orleans Avenue. According to the NOPD, Tank would be seen on dash cam video hitting at officers while fleeing. Upon the officer returning, Tank will fall to the ground. After a brief period of motionless, Tank would then be seen moving his arm, hitting himself in the head. Tank will be hit 3 times, once to the leg, once to the lung, and one self-inflicted. Due to video evidence, Tank's passing will be classified with a self-inflicted wound. Detectives will gather early on a Saturday on a blighted Gentile street and tend to the city's latest deletion. They will find a familiar face. In the 3500 block of Hamburg Street would lay Jarrell Smith, aka Jigga. He had been crushed. During the past decade, Jigga would elude the NOPD like perhaps no other accused criminal in New Orleans history. Time and again, prosecutors and police would tie him to crushings, lock him up, and prepare a case only for it to fall apart. Due to the witnesses being afraid to come forward, no one, and I mean no one, would testify against Jigga. If they did plan on testifying, they would not make it to court. The NOPD would allege in 2003, Jigga was paid $10,000 to delete James Tapp, aka Soldier Slim. His alleged accomplice, Stephen Kennedy, aka SK, will be crushed in Houston, Texas. No witness will come forward on the deletion of Slim. The case would be dropped. That same year, the NOPD would claim that Jigga smashed Spencer Smith Jr. As with previous cases, witnesses wouldn't come forward and the case would be dropped. In 2007, Jigga was locked up for the crushing of 24-year-old Mandel Duplessis. That same year, Jigga would also be locked up on charges for crushing Terry Brock. As with all of the previous cases, no witnesses, no case. The charges would be dropped.